unfree labor in the New World. That's what we're talking about right now. You're going to see there's going to be 3 types of unfree labor. And so for each of those types of unfree labor, we're also going to be looking at a rebellion. So 3 types of unfree labor, 3 rebellions. That's what we're looking at today. So let's kind of start right off the bat by looking at our rebellions. And so for Native Americans, we're going to see the type of unfree labor connected with them is the encomienda system. And a rebellion against that would be Pope's rebellion. For Europeans, we're going to look at indentured servants, and the rebellion involving indentured servants is Bacon's rebellion. And then for Africans, we'll look at chattel slavery, and the rebellion connected with chattel slavery we're going to look at is the Stono Rebellion. And so when I'm talking about unfree labor, it's a technical term that in a sense just means forced labor. So you could be forced into this labor due to threat of violence. You could be forced into this labor due to extreme destitution. And so just to clarify, I'm not equating them, meaning that all 3 are equally bad, but what groups them together is the sense that they're unfree, that they're in a sense forced into it one way or the other. So let's start looking. So the first thing we have are Native Americans and the encomienda system. And in the rebellion connected with the encomienda system is Pope's rebellion. So that's what we're looking at first. So before we take any notes, just to review a little bit of European history. So remember the Middle Ages, also known as the Dark Ages, right? It's the time after the fall of Rome, but before the Renaissance starts, where you have like lords and knights and peasants and serfs. That's what we need to remember. Because remember what's happening, I'm going to go over here, is that the lord would have a fief or a parcel of land, and then the lord was supposed to protect those on his land. And in exchange, the people living on the land was supposed to work for free. And so you would have a lord and you would have a serf. So what's happening is Spain, and this is specific to Spain, Spain is taking that system of feudalism and plopping it down in the middle of the New World. So let's kind of compare the two, the encomienda system with the feudalism, All right, so here's the idea. An encomienda is a chunk of land. It's a plantation, it might be a mine, but it's a parcel of land that's given to a Spaniard in the New World, right? So if you owned the land, you would be called an encomiendero, right? And that means that you owned the encomienda, right? Or that parcel of land. And just as a side note, the encomienda comes from the word that means to entrust or to commend. So I might say, you know, I'm going to commend your soul to the Lord, which means I'm going to entrust it to the Lord. And so the whole idea is this is supposed to be kind of like feudalism. So the encomiendero has the parcel of land, is in control of it. They're kind of like the Lord. And then the natives living on the land are almost like the serfs from the Middle Ages, right? They're supposed to be protected by the Lord, but also they're supposed to work for the Lord. So in this case, what's going to happen is the encomiendero would get this parcel of land from the Spanish government, and what they were supposed to do is protect the natives, but also to evangelize the natives, which means to bring them Christianity, right? And so that's how the system was supposed to work. But we'll see there's a lot of abuse and a lot of corruption. So here's another slide. It's kind of saying the same thing, what the plan was versus what actually was reality. So here's the plan. This is what was supposed to happen, right? The Spanish settler protected and cared for and Christianized the Indians. And then in return, the native worked a portion of their time for the Spanish settlers. That's how it was supposed to work, but in reality, that's not exactly how it went. The reality, Spanish settlers forced long labor, don't pay the workers, failed to protect the Indians and seize their land. And the reality is Indians die of disease like smallpox and die of harsh living and working conditions. And so the plan versus the reality, you can see there's a lot of abuse in the system. And people, like we mentioned, like Bartolomé de las Casas, will be working to try to end the system. And the system will end gradually, but it'll take a while. Right, so here's the little primary source. So this primary source is nothing that you need to know for a test, but it's just showing you kind of a little bit of some of the abuse that was present in the encomienda system. And so this is a law that was attempting to reform the encomienda system. And so if you see a law that's reforming a system, you can also see the brokenness that was present in the first place. And so I'm just going to read it. This is not going to be on a test or anything like that, but this is a law trying to make the Spanish be nicer to the Native Americans. All right, here we go. Also, we order and command that no person or persons shall dare to beat any Indians with sticks, or whip him, or call him dog, or address him by any name other than his proper name alone. And if an Indian should deserve to be punished for something he has done, the said person having him in charge shall bring him to the visitor for punishment, on pain that person who violates this article shall pay, for every time he beats or whips an Indian or Indians, 5 pesos gold. And if he should call an Indian dog, or address him by any name other than his own, he shall pay 1 gold peso to be distributed in a manner stated. And so, more or less, you cannot physically harm your native. You would have to bring him before, I'm guessing, a court here, or the visitor, if you had to punish them by means of beating or whipping. You had to get permission for that, or else you'd be fined. So just a little bit of an illustration about how the encomienda system was abused. Not to say that the encomienda system was just in the first place, but even the system they set up was abused. All right, moving on. So now we are moving on to the rebellion connected with the encomienda system. But before we talk about Pope's rebellion or the Pueblo Revolt, we have to kind of remind ourselves of what's going on in New Mexico. So this is review. So review time. Don Juan de Oñate. He was the last conquistador, remember him? Of course. And he was in New Mexico. He conquered the Pueblo people, and he was the one responsible for the Coma massacre, the massacre after which people were enslaved or they lost their foot. And so just to kind of remind you of what's happening in New Mexico that could lead to a rebellion. All right, so let's look at the rebellion itself. And so, like I said, there's 2 names for this. I hear it oftentimes called Pope's Rebellion, but it's also called Pueblo Revolt. So I want you to be familiar with both names because you never know which one might end up on a test. All right, so once again, just setting up the framework. We're not talking about the rebellion yet, but setting it up. So Oñate came about 80 years before the rebellion took place. So for 80 years, the Pueblo people were being subjugated by the Spanish. And then we're going to see, spoiler alert, the rebellion is successful in the sense that these Pueblo people are able to overthrow Spanish rule, but they're only able to keep their independence from Spain for only about 12 years before the Spanish come back. So just to kind of put this into a framework for you. All right, so what was it? Let's actually talk about what this rebellion was. So this is what's happening. Pope is a Pueblo Indian. He's a Native American, and he had been imprisoned by the Spanish because he was a medicine man. And so after he was released from prison, he spent 5 years planning this revolt against Spanish rule. Because remember, what he wants to do is to get rid of the Spanish. And so what he does is he organizes a joint attack against the Spanish in 46 different Pueblo towns. And so he goes from village to village, town from town, trying to convince the natives to join him in this revolt. So it's a coordinated attack against the Spanish in 46 towns. Okay. So when the day comes, there's an uprising in all of these towns throughout New Mexico, and they're really destroying all things Spanish, all things Catholic. As a result, they're successful. As a result, 400 Spanish are killed, and the remaining around 2,000 flee. And so this is a successful revolt. But like I said, it'll be somewhat short-lived because 12 years later, the Spanish are able to come back. All right. So this is what happened. This joint attack on in these 46 towns against all things Spanish. And they're destroying things that are Catholic, so churches, killing priests, but really anything linked to the Spanish. So they're killing livestock, right? They kill the cows because the cows were Spanish. So it's a joint attack against all things Spanish, and it will work for about 12 years. Eventually what's going to happen is Pope is going to die, and when he dies, that leadership he offered that leadership he offered is gone, and so that alliance between these different towns starts to splinter, and it'll make it easier for the Spanish to come back. So just keep in mind, this is successful, but only lasts about 12 years. So that's what happened. We need to talk about why it happened, because the why it happened is really important too. All right, so this is why the Pueblo people decided to rebel. Okay, so there's a lot of different causes. Once again, if you're taking notes, write small and or use your own words, right? You don't have to write this down word for word. So here's some of the causes. So something kind of just as a side note, something to understand is the Pueblo people are a very peaceful people, right? There's some Native American groups who are like in their culture, they're very warlike. The Iroquois are going to be very warlike. The Apache are very warlike. But the Pueblo people are pretty peaceful and they're just farmers, right? So to get them riled up enough to attack the Spanish, it's going to take a lot. Okay, so let's look at some of the things that are happening. One, missionaries, right? These are Franciscan priests who come along with the Spanish. Missionaries are suppressing native practices that were inconsistent with Christianity. And that involved burning some of the sacred objects of the native people. Another thing is courts, so like the Spanish courts, gave out punishments like hanging, whipping, dismemberments, which means losing a foot or a hand, being condemned to slavery. So the Spanish government was handing out some pretty harsh punishments to the natives who were stepping out of line. And then the Spanish were demanding a tribute from the natives, or like a tax. And so they were taking crops from the natives as a tax. And finally, we talked about already, the encomienda system is a thing that existed in New Mexico. So if you were going to build a new courthouse, for example, you would get Native Americans and force them to build your courthouse. So all of these things combined are why we're going to see the Native Americans revolting. All right. Final thing with Pope's rebellion, or the Pueblo Revolt, is this. So keep in mind, there are a number of key concepts connected with American history, and this is one of them. I'm just going to read it. Key concept, brought to you by the College Board who makes AP US History. Right? Spanish colonizing efforts in North America, particularly after the Pueblo Revolt, saw an accommodation with some aspects of American Indian culture. So what that means is this is a turning point, right? Like the ballerina's turning on a point. So a turning point. So after the Pueblo Revolt, after Pope's rebellion, we're going to see the Spanish lighten up a little bit and allow the Native Americans to keep at least some of their cultural practices, right? And then later on, this key concept is going to more or less contrast that with Britain, who is not going to allow any sort of accommodation whatsoever. And so after Pope's rebellion, the Spanish lighten up a bit and allows Native Americans to keep more of their culture. Let's look at a primary source. Okay, I'm just going to have to move my face around so you can see this as we go. And so this is from a Native American, the same year of Pope's revolt, or I should say the Pueblo Revolt or Pope's Rebellion. And he's imprisoned and he's explaining what happened during this time. So this is an Indian prisoner, 1680. Asked for what reason they so blindly burned the images, temples, crosses, and other things of divine worship, he stated that the Indian, Pope, ordered in all the pueblos or towns through which he passed that they instantly break up and burn the images of Holy Christ, the Virgin Mary, and other saints, the crosses, and everything pertaining to Christianity, and that they burn the temples, break up the bells, and separate from the wives whom God had given them in marriage, and take those who they desired. So remember, when the Franciscans are coming in, the missionaries are coming in, right? They're imposing, if you will, Christianity on the natives, as opposed to, for example, the French. The French were more accommodating, allowing the natives to keep their culture, but introducing Christianity. But we'll see the Spanish are harsher that way. And so what happens is, when this breaks out, when the rebellion's happening, they're destroying all things to have to do with Catholicism. All right, continuing on. In order to take away their baptismal names, The water and the holy oils they were to plunge into rivers and wash themselves, washing even their clothing, with the understanding that they would thus be taken from them the character of the holy sacraments. And so when they were baptized or received any of the sacraments, baptism involves both water and oil. And so they're trying to unbaptize themselves by washing themselves in the river. Finally, they thereby returned to the state of antiquity, that this was the better life and the one they desired, because the God of the Spaniards was worth nothing, and theirs was very strong. Pope saw to it they at once erected and rebuilt their houses of idolatry, so they're rebuilding their houses of worship, and made very ugly masks and to mirror the devil, we'll go with that word. And he said otherwise, that the devil had given them an understanding that living thus in accord with the law of their ancestors, they would have harvest, a great deal of maize, many beans, an abundance of cotton, calabasas, and large watermelons and cantaloupes, and that they could erect their houses and enjoy an abundant health and leisure. And so apparently Pope said that if we get rid of all things Christian and we kind of come back to our ancestral religion, that they would be promised a great abundance and a life of leisure. And so that's just a little primary source for us. We are now looking at a new set of unfree labor, and this is European. This is indentured servants, and the rebellion is Bacon's rebellion. Let's look. All right, so first things first, what in the world is an indentured servant? So this is an indentured servant, right? This is a European. So you would have to give up 5 to 7 years of your life and work as a servant. So 5 to 7 years of servitude, I think 5 would be pretty typical. So you're signing a contract and you're saying, I'm going to work for 5 to 7 years for you. But in return, what you got was you got passage to the new world. And then after your contract was up, after you served your 5 to 7 years, then you get something called your freedom dues. And so your freedom dues, it really depended on your contract, on which colony you're headed for. But freedom dues might be a set of clothes, some tools, some food, maybe a gun. Sometimes, maybe if you're lucky, some money. Sometimes, maybe if you're lucky, some land. But it'd be something to kind of get you started in your new life after you're done with your contract. But you can see not many people lived to see the end of their contract. Only about 40% or 4 out of 10 indentured servants actually survived to get their freedom dues. And so this is due mostly to disease at this point. All right, so let's go back and look at some push and pull factors. So push factors are what would push you to become an indentured servant? What would draw you to want to become an indentured servant? So there's a couple of things going on, historically speaking, that would maybe make you more willing to become an indentured servant. One is the economy, okay? So we have a rapid population growth. Remember, things like corn and potatoes are increasing the food supply. That's going to increase the population. So you have this rapid population growth, but at the same time, you have an economic depression. Specifically, if you're talking about England, you're talking about the wool market. And so there's a lot of people, not a lot of jobs, which equated with, quote unquote, a surplus population. More people than jobs, okay? And so you could be a member of the surplus population and you would be hard out because there's no jobs, right? There's no jobs. All right, another thing that would make you more likely to become an indentured servant is this tradition called primogeniture. And this is specific, once again, to England we're talking about. And this is the tradition that only the oldest son would inherit the estate. Because you don't want to break up the wealth or the prestige of a family by dividing the wealth among many sons. Instead, you wanted to keep the estate together, and so only the oldest son would inherit it. So if you have an older brother, they get all the land, you get nothing. And so maybe you might consider becoming an indentured servant. And so here you go. You think you have second child problems. You must know all about primogeniture. So this is a push factor why you might be pushed into indentured servitude. Now we're going to look at pull factors. So these are reasons why why colonists wanted more and more indentured servants to come over. One is tobacco growers are needed, specifically if we're talking around the Chesapeake, right, Virginia. They needed a workforce. And at this time, slaves were really expensive, and so they weren't the best option. And also we know natives are going to die quickly of diseases. And so when we're talking about very beginnings of American history, the main labor pool is going to be coming from indentured servants. And so you can kind of see a fact and figure there to illustrate that. About half are coming as indentured servants in the 16 and the 1700s. So half of those who are coming to the New World are coming as indentured servants. And there's a system connected with this, specifically in Virginia, I'd like you to know about is the head right system. So it's a way to recruit people to come to Virginia to grow that tobacco, to make all the money. And that's the idea that for every indentured servant you sponsored or you paid to come over, you would get 50 acres, right? The indentured servant gets nothing, but you as the sponsor or the one paying for the indentured servant would get 50 acres of land. So this is kind of a little bit like a patroonship that they had in New Netherlands, if you remember that. So it's a recruitment tool. So for every indentured servant, you get 50 acres of land. All right. Go. All right. So now we're going to look at a rebellion connected with indentured servants, and it's none other than Bacon's rebellion. So we're going to give you the basics really quick, and then we're going to head into the causes of it. So the basic facts of this rebellion, what's happening. So it's led by Nathaniel Bacon, ergo Bacon's rebellion, and about 1,000 others. And these are mostly former indentured servants living in Virginia. So most of these are former indentured servants. And so what do? They attack the governor, William Berkeley, and they set fire to the Capitol. They set fire to Jamestown. So they're attacking the governor. The governor is going to flee, and they're burning down Jamestown. Okay? How does it end? Well, Nathaniel Bacon, at the tender age of 29, ends up dying of dysentery. So dysentery, more or less, is you have extreme diarrhea, which ends up you becoming dehydrated, which ends up you dying. And so he dies of disease at 29. And when the leader dies, then what's going to happen is the governor's going to come back. Governor William Berkeley is going to come back, and he's going to squash the rebellion. And the governor, in retaliation for this rebellion, has 23 of its leaders hung or killed. And so it's going to be squashed, and the governor's going to kind of lay down the hammer, right? Really going to punish that severely. And so the big idea is, why is this important? Well, what it's going to do is we're going to see a shift. So after this point, or before this point, we're going to see a lot of colonists relying on indentured servants as the main source of labor. And after this, though, it's going to start to slowly switch to African slaves because the colonists are less likely or less willing to let indentured servants come. So in a sense, it's going to be a turning point as well, because this is when we're going to switch from kind of indentured servants into African slaves. So that's the basics, but also we want to know why. Why the rebellion? Why the rebellion? Let's look at some reasons. Okay. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. Here we go. All right, so here's a little bit of some background here. So here's the idea. Former indentured servants really have a hard time at life. If they survive to get their freedom dues, oftentimes those don't include land. So you have no land. And also keep in mind, life is hard, right? So there's not a lot of women in the New World, and those women only want to marry people that have land, and you have no land, so that's hard. Another thing that happens is the House of Burgesses. Remember, the Congress in charge of Virginia just took away your right to vote. So if you have no land, you have no franchise, which means you have no right to vote. And so these indentured servants are upset. But that's not the actual spark of it. This is what's happening. Okay, just hold on tight. So here's the idea. You have no land, but you still have to farm in order to survive. And so what you're going to do is you're going to build your farm out on the frontier, right? So you're going to be putting your farm out here. All right, so this is Jamestown, the capital of Virginia, and this is the different areas of the Chesapeake that was already settled. But you can't buy land, you can't afford it, and so you're going to be a squatter out here. But you notice there's also Native Americans living out here. And so what's going to happen is you're going to get attacked by Native Americans time and time again. And so as a former indentured servant who's getting attacked by Native Americans, you're going to complain. You're going to go to Jamestown, the capital, and ask for help, right? Because that's one of the reasons the government's there. They're supposed to help you. But the government says, no, we're not going to do anything. You're on your own, right? Side note, Governor Berkeley, who's the governor of Virginia at the time, was making a lot of money through the fur trade, and so the governor wasn't doing anything for personal reasons as well. He didn't want to upset his influx of cash he was getting in the fur trade. So what happens is Bacon's Rebellion, actually first thing is these disgruntled former indentured servants actually start to attack Native Americans first. And so you can see here's kind of their campaign. They're attacking different groups of Native Americans. And then after nothing is done, then they go and attack Jamestown. So it's a little bit of a background there. Another thing to kind of note is Nathaniel Bacon himself wasn't actually a former indentured servant. He was actually from quite a wealthy family in England, and they kind of sent him to the New World to kind of grow up a little bit. And so just kind of as a side note there, just realize that Nathaniel Bacon himself, with his fancy collar right there, you can see, he wasn't actually a former indentured servant, but he was their leader. All right. So that is Bacon's Rebellion, connected with indentured servants. Last, but very much not least, is Africans. And so we're going to see African Americans and chattel slavery, and then the Stono Rebellion. So let's talk about slavery. And so obviously this is the most severe of all of the three types of unfree labor we talked about today. And the type of slavery this is specifically is chattel slavery, which means the individual is not just forced to work, but they're treated as personal property. So you could be bought, you could be sold. So for example, in the encomienda system, you could force a Native American to work for you, but you couldn't sell them. Right? So this is specifically when you can, they're treated as personal property to be bought and sold. And also with chattel slavery, then not only would you own the person forever, but also you would own all of their descendants. So you'd own their kids, their grandkids, all of their descendants would be a part of the slavery. So this is called chattel slavery. Chattel is just another word meaning personal property. Okay? So this is specific to African Americans here. All right, moving on. So this is once again review, but let's get ourselves situated into what's happening in Europe. So this is review. Okay, so remember the Portuguese. Of course you remember the Portuguese from world history. The Portuguese were one of the first European nations to start exploring, right? They explored around the west coast of Africa. They set up different trading posts here as well. But what happens eventually is the Portuguese decide, you know where the real money is? The real money is in sugar plantations. And so it's going to be the Portuguese who are, of course, are kind of colonizing Brazil that kind of first set up these sugar plantations. And as they're setting up sugar plantations in Brazil, they're going to need a workforce, and they choose none other than the Africans from West Africa. And so this is a picture of a sugar plantation, a Portuguese sugar plantation. You can see that these are African slaves working there. And so kind of the first instance, if you will, of African slaves being used in the New World is really kind of the fruit of these Portuguese sugar plantations. So just to remind you where this started. But what you do need to know is this kickstarts something called the Atlantic Slave Trade, brought to you by the name of the Atlantic Ocean. So the Atlantic Slave Trade is going to be where we're going to see slaves from West Africa brought across to work in the New World. And so when we're talking about the Atlantic part, once again, we're talking about they're crossing the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so why the Atlantic Slave Trade? Well, we're talking about indentured servants kind of going away. we mentioned this before, but in the 1680s, life in England's getting better, and so you have less and less people willing to go over in the first place. And then, of course, we already talked about things like Bacon's Rebellion, which made indentured servants less popular source of labor. But also, there is something called the Royal African Company. And this was a company Britain set up to run the trade between between the British colonies, North America, and Africa. And so for a long time, they had a monopoly. So with the British colonies, you could only buy your slaves from the Royal African Company. But once that Royal African Company lost their monopoly, then what we're going to see is slaves become cheaper for the British colonists, and also they're becoming more available because now other companies, other countries can come in and sell slaves to the British colonies as well. So besides the fact that there's less indentured servants in the first place, and the fact that slaves are going to become more abundant and cheaper because the Royal African Company lost the monopoly, we're going to see a huge intake in the amount of African slaves coming to the British colonies. All right, but also keep in mind, just looking at this map, they're going to the British colonies, they're going to the sugar islands of the West Indies. A lot of them are going to end up Brazil, where the Portuguese are growing sugar as well. All right, so this is just a chart to kind of just show you numbers. So the traditional number is about 11 million. So how many Africans were enslaved and brought across to the New World? Well, about 11 million. All right, so 11 million. And out of that 11 million, you can see about 4% actually ended up in the British colonies. All right, so you can see most of them, a lot of them, 35% are going to be in Brazil, but only about 4% are actually going to end up in the British colonies. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. Another thing just to kind of keep in mind is we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade, right, across the Atlantic. But keep in mind there's other slave trades happening in Africa as well. And so we have like the Arab slave trade, where we're going to see the East Coast slaves are going to be sold into like the Arabian Peninsula, for example. And so just keep in mind there are different types, and we're specifically looking at the Atlantic. Okay, that's just kind of a side note. Another thing, we're going to kind of just get a little preview here of U.S. history of slavery. So this is not anything that'll be on a test this time around, but just you can kind of see when we're talking about African slavery in the United States. So remember, the first instance of it is in Jamestown. We have a primary source from John Rolfe, right, the guy who brought in tobacco, that said a Dutch ship sold 20-odd African slaves to the colonists. So like about 20 come to Jamestown. So that's the first instance of it. And we're going to see in 1808, the Atlantic slave trade is going to be outlawed in the United States. So once we got their independence, they kind of came up with the date of 1808. They said in 1808, we're going to stop buying slaves. But slavery will continue until the 13th Amendment in 1865. And so the slaves we have after 1808 are just the natural increase that we'll see. We're not going to buy any more people from Africa, but instead this is going to be the children of slaves, right? So as slaves have more children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, that's where the number is going to come from. So this is just kind of to give you a sense of where we're going to head in the future when we're talking about slaves and the end of slavery, African slavery. All right, moving on. So we're looking at our rebellion connected with chattel slavery. So once again, I'm going to give you the basics, and then we're going to look a little bit more in depth after I give you the basics. So we're going to talk about a number of African slave rebellions in U.S. history, specifically as we get closer to the Civil War. But this is the one connected with our colonial unit. So this is happening in colonial America before our revolution. And so this is what happens. This is in South Carolina on the Stono River, right? So that's why it's called the Stono Rebellion. And it's going to be led by a slave named Jimmy. And so Jimmy is going to rob a warehouse and get a bunch of guns and ammo. And then he's going to gather more and more slaves together, and they're going to try to escape to Florida. Because this is the situation, right? Spain controls Florida, And there was a proclamation that said any slaves that made it to Spanish-controlled Florida would get their freedom. And so Jimmy and a group of others, they get a bunch of guns and ammo, and then their whole goal is to escape into Spanish Florida where they get their freedom. However, they are first stopped by the militia of South Carolina, and as the aftermath, or in the aftermath, there's about 21 colonists who are killed during the rebellion. And so as they're traveling, they're killing whites. And so there's 21 colonists who are killed in the rebellion, and then there's 44 Africans who were killed. Some of those during the rebellion, but a lot of them were executed afterwards, and those who weren't executed were sold to the West Indies, because clearly South Carolina didn't want them around anymore because they're afraid this might happen again. And another big result of this is, of course, the enactment of some more slave codes. So slave codes would further prevent slaves from gaining an education, things like that. So a slave code might be, it's against the law to teach an African slave to read, something like that. All right, so that's the basic of what is happening. Jimmy has a bunch of ammo and guns, he steals, and then they start to just kind of go south towards Spain, or towards Spanish-controlled Florida, killing people on the way. And then as a result, we're going to see 44 Africans are killed, and then we're going to see slave codes start to become enacted. And so we're going to look really briefly at a map, just so you can kind of get a sense of where we're talking about. So there's South Carolina, hey! South Carolina's up here, and then this is Charleston, and the Stono River is just south of Charleston. So you could say it happened in Charleston if you wanted to, but technically it's right south of Charleston. Here's the Stono River over here, and then they were trying to escape into Spanish-controlled Florida. They would still have to march through Georgia to do that, but that was the name of the game. All right, and so once again, here's Spanish-controlled Florida. They're trying to go from there to there. All right, so here is a primary source. And so this is going to be the governor of South Carolina reporting to the Royal Council the month after what happened. So it happened in September. This is him writing about what happened the next month in October. So this is the governor of South Carolina. I had the honor some time ago to lay before your grace some account of our affairs in regard to the desertion of our Negroes, who are encouraged to it by a certain proclamation published by the King of Spain's order at St. Augustine, declaring freedom to all Negroes who should desert hither from the British colonies. So, right, if anyone leaves the British colonies, they get their freedom in Spain. On the 9th of September last, at night, a great number of Negroes arose in rebellion, broke open a store where they got arms, killed 21 white persons, and were marching in a daring manner out of the province, killing all they met and burning the houses on the road through which they passed, returning in any way from the southward with 4 gentlemen. I met these rebels at 11 o'clock in the forenoon, so in the morning, so that I fortunately discerned the danger time enough to avoid it, and to give notice to the militia who on the occasion behaved with so much expedition and bravery as by 4 o'clock the same day to come up with them. Right? So more or less this guy, the governor, at 11 o'clock in the morning, figured out what was happening, escaped, and was able to raise up the militia. And the militia started to squash the rebellion. All right, I'm going to move my face here so you can see. Okay. As by 4 o'clock the same day, come up to them and killed and took so many as put a stop to any further mischief at that time. 44 of the rebels have been killed and executed. Some few yet remain concealed in the woods and expecting the same fate seem desperate. So this is the governor of South Carolina kind of reporting what he saw at the Stono River in the Stono Rebellion. All right, last thing we're going to look at here is we're just going to add this to when we're talking about chattel slavery, African slavery. We also need to kind of look at how when Africans are coming to the British colonies, how we start to see a blending of cultures, African culture blending with kind of British culture. So we're going to just look at a couple of things really briefly here. I wasn't quite sure where to place this, so I thought we're talking about African slavery, we'll just kind of place it in this context. And so we're going to look at the Gullah language, the banjo and the bongo, and a lovely fact here. So you can go ahead, write these down, I'll kind of explain it as we go. So the Gullah language, like I said, we're talking about blending two cultures together. It's a blending of languages. It's a blending of African languages with British languages as well. And they're on these little islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. And so there'll be these little islands out here where some African slaves were able to escape to and get their freedom. And on these islands, they're going to be developing these very unique languages called the Gullah language. And like I said, it's spoken on these little islands of South Carolina and Georgia, and a mixture of English and a variety of African languages. So that's an example. If you ever remember back in the day, there was a TV show, I think on Nick Jr. called Gullah Gullah Island. It was very exciting. I think this guy's a frog. Maybe that's just me who's seen it, but that's fun. All right. Another thing we talked about, or Will mentioned, is the banjo and the bongo. And so once again, this is going to be a blending of cultures. So these are instruments that were designed in the New World, but were really similar to instruments that were back in Africa. And so the banjo, and then the bongo, same sort of idea. I think this is specifically Africans living on Cuba that come up with the banjo. And then finally, the last fact is just the idea is so many of the African slaves that came over were men. So about 2/3 of all of those coming to the New World as slaves through the Atlantic slave trade were men. And there was so much so that men back home, back in Africa, actually started to take multiple wives because there are more women than men left in Africa. And so this is another effect of the African slave trade. And like I said, I didn't really know where to put these in any lectures, so I just kind of set them there. All right, was there anything else? I think that was it. All right, so let's just kind of review quick and then we'll go. So once again, we're talking about unfree labor. So this is forced labor. We saw 3 different types. We saw the encomienda system, we saw indentured servants, we saw chattel slavery, and then we saw rebellions connected with each. We saw Pope's rebellion or the Pueblo Revolt, we saw Bacon's rebellion, and then we saw the Stono rebellion. And so like I said, they're not at all the same in level of severity, but what brings them together is the idea that it's forced labor, forced through the use of violence, or forced through just straight up destitution. All right, so that is a little bit of unfree labor in the New World.